Hello everybody and welcome to episode 10 of Designers Learning jQuery. Today we're just going to cover a quick tip, which is how to tell if an element that you're trying to select is actually on the page. And this isn't as straightforward as you might expect, and some more advanced developers who are working with jQuery for the first time often run into this problem and they have to figure out how to make this work. So I'm going to show you how to do it. So we're going to get started with an HTML page that just has a list of animals. And what we want to do is one of the animals in this list might have a class of highlighted. And if it does, then we want to create this extra div on the page that highlights the name of the animal and calls it out as like an animal spotlight. So let's take a look at the code. And you can see it's our typical HTML document, and all we have is a heading and then a list of items. And the frilled neck lizard happens to have a class of highlighted. So we want to create another place on the page where we can spotlight that this is the highlighted animal. So maybe this is something where we're highlighting an animal once a week or once a month or something like that. So let's jump over to our JavaScript and let's add that element to the page. We already did an episode on how to manipulate the DOM and add new elements. We're going to use the skills that we learned in that podcast. So we'll say var spotlight, which is what we'll call our new spotlight div. And we'll create the $, and we'll create that new div that we want to put on the page in there, just like that. And then we'll go ahead and say insert after, and we'll put it after the H1. Now, of course, if we look at the page now, that won't show up at all because we haven't styled it with CSS and it doesn't have any content. So let's jump into our style sheet to just add a quick couple of styles to that box so that we can see it on the page. So we're going to select the class of Spotlight. And let's add a background color, and I feel like a pale yellow would be a good thing for a spotlight, and a border that's just a little bit darker. So we'll call that lemon chiffon. And then we don't want it to be going like crazy all across the page, so we'll go ahead and set the display to inline block. And then finally we want to give our text a little breathing room and not have it right up against the border, so we'll add a little bit of padding. So that's all we're going to do for CSS for today. Now if I refresh the page in the browser, you can now see this pale yellow box that shows up over here. And now let's write the JavaScript to add a little bit of content to it. So what we want to do is select this list item that has a class of highlighted and get the text that's inside this list item, which in this case is frilled neck lizard, and we want to display it in that box. So let's take a look at what we can do. So first we could see that highlighted is going to be equal to our class of highlighted. And then we can say spotlight.text. And this is what we want to set the text to. We want to say like in the spotlight. But then we also want to add in the text that's in the highlighted list item. And we can get that by saying highlighted.text, just like that. Now if we come back over here and refresh the page, in the spotlight, the frilled neck lizard. That's exactly what we wanted. If we come back over here and take this class of highlighted and put it on, let's say the meerkat, and save that, and come back over here, refresh the page, we now see that the meerkat is in the spotlight. But what happens if we don't have a list item with the class of highlighted? Well, now we still get in the spotlight and nothing shows up. Maybe we'd like to do something different. So let's say that we want to say, hey, no animals are in the spotlight, if there aren't any in the spotlight. So how can we do that? Well, we could say if, and this is where we're going to run our test to say if the element exists, then we want to go ahead and do this. If it doesn't exist, then we want to go ahead and say spotlight.text. No animals are in the spotlight. Just like that. But how do we tell if there is a highlighted item on the page? Now you might guess that you do it like this, where you would check to see if this variable held something. So if the variable is empty and I say if, then that will return false. Now JavaScript gets a little tricky with true and false, and we'll actually say that the values aren't actually true or false, they're kind of truthy and falsy. So an empty variable, if I test it, is going to return false. But if the variable contains something, then it's going to return true. So we know that if there's nothing on the page with a class of highlighted, then this variable should be empty and this should return false, which means that we should get no animals are in the spotlight. Now let's double check our HTML page. We have nothing here with a class of highlighted, so let's see what happens when we refresh. We're still getting this in the spotlight text if highlighted. So somehow highlighted has a truthy value even though there isn't any elements on the page with a class of highlighted. The reason for this is that the variable highlighted isn't actually empty. It contains a jQuery object. The jQuery object happens to be empty, but the variable highlighted doesn't necessarily know that. Now, if you want to think about exactly what that means, what a jQuery object is, you could think of a jQuery object as a box that we're putting around our elements. So whatever we're selecting, if we're selecting all the items of the class of highlighted, basically we're wrapping all of that up in a box. And what happens when there aren't any elements on the page, we get an empty box, but we still get a box. So highlighted is still a truthy value because it does contain the box even though it's an empty box. So what we have to actually test is not if the variable contains anything, but if the box contains anything. And how we can do that is we can test the length property of the jQuery object. Whoops, and we have to spell it correctly, of course. So what we want to say is if the length is greater than 0, then we know that it found something on the page with that class. Otherwise, it will say no animals are in the spotlight. So now let's go over here and refresh the page. Of course, we have to save this file first. So now we can go over here, refresh the page, and we can see no animals are in the spotlight. And if we add that highlighted class back, and refresh the page, then we can see that that's the animal that shows up in the spotlight. So that's how you can test if an element exists on the page. You'll test the length of the jQuery object, which will tell you if you have an empty box or a box that has some DOM elements inside of it. That's all I've got for you today. So thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about jQuery, pick up a copy of my book, jQuery for Designers, available now.